The first session is called Reading Between the Lines, the Fine Act of Translations. One of the most difficult aspects of any translation is to do a good one, keeping the essence of the original intact. Taking us through this, we have these four distinguished writers and translators and organizers. Let me introduce them one by one. We have Mr. Hahn. Is that the correct pronunciation I've got? Yes. Okay. Hahn is a writer, editor, and translator. His books include the Tar Menagerie. Is that the correct pronunciation? Yeah. And biographies of the poets Coleridge and Shelley. Mr. Hahn holds a BA in English from Cambridge and an MA in Comparative Literature from University College London. Then we have Keerthi Ramachandra. She is by aptitude, inclination, and training a teacher, a translator by virtue of being multilingual, and an editor by default. Keerthi translates from Marathi, Kannada, and Hindi into English. Her translations for Katha won her the A.K. Ramanujam Award for Translation from 2 or more languages. So big round of applause for Keerthi as well. Then we have Rakshanda Jalil. She's a writer, critic, and literary historian. She has several books to her credit, such as The Temple and the Mosque, 2011, Liking Progress, Loving Change, A Literary History of the Progressive Writers Movement in Urdu, 2014, and Pigeons of the Domes, 2015, among many others. Big round of applause for Rakshanda. And today's session will be moderated by Prashasti Rastogi. She is the director of the German Book Office of the Frankfurt Book Fair in New Delhi. She has been involved in expanding the scope of engagement of Frankfurt Book Fair with the Indian media and publishing industry. She has over 10 years of international experience in leading strategy, operations, and marketing communication in education, technology, and publishing sector. Big round of applause for her as well. With this, we begin. We have 1 hour, and over to you, Prashasti.
So very good morning. Tough task to turn up on a Saturday morning at 10 a.m., but I'm sure the topic is enriching, engaging, and I'm privileged to be sharing this days with three very, very significant people who have contributed in different ways to bring out the voice of translated writers into mainstream and given us the privilege of reading such texts we otherwise would not have access to, considering there are certain languages we don't have access to. This session is made possible by my organization, Frankfurt Book Fair, and I would like to spend a minute on talking about what interests us in the area of translations. I represent the German language market, the German language book market in India, and if I were to throw out some statistics, I wanted to actually do a comparative of what is the scenario in India. But unfortunately, there aren't any statistics that I could find which I could rely on. But for the German book market, as we can clearly see, English is predominant. We have about 12,000 titles translated in the previous year, 2015-16, from international languages into German. 11 of the top bestsellers in the fiction list are from English. So therefore, clearly 2/3 of the market, German market, is being dominated by English translations, about 74% of the entire fiction market, that would be. And as far as categories are concerned, fiction is the top selling in international translations. Second segment is children's and young adult. I mean, Germany is known to be very, very strong in terms of its own children's books, especially the translated, the illustrated picture books. But again, very, very prolific in terms of translation, because a lot of international stories are appreciated and well read in Germany. As far as languages are concerned, English, I've categorically told, is the top seller. Second is Japanese, primarily because of manga. And the third one is French in fiction and non-fiction domain. French, obviously, the close ties, and the guest of honor for 2017 Frankfurt Book Fair is France. So there are commissioned 2,000 translations that have happened in the past year from French into German. So that has also kind of skewed the numbers here. But overall, Chinese market is also growing. Germany is taking particular interest in Chinese. Now, if I move to India, Germany is particularly doing Indian translations as well. It's quite heartwarming to see that there's a publishing house in Germany which is specially dedicated to Indian language translations done from India into German. It's called Draupadi Verlag, based out of Heidelberg, which has been the seat of Indology for many, many years, and therefore the culture. Gitanjali, Shri, Altaf Tayawala, many of the prolific writers have been translated into German with the support of the Frankfurt Book Fair's LitCam program, under which we grant translation grants for translation from South Asian and African literature into German. So that is why for us it is very important that these conversations happen more often and there's more exchange. The German Book Office has been quite active in bringing together Indian publishers, quite forcefully as well sometimes, to talk to each other and discover what is happening in each other's literature, because sometimes because the society has come to a point where English has become a binding language, we really don't know what's happening in each other's market, so to say. So a Hindi editor would never come to know what a Malayalam publishing house is doing if it's not made into mainstream news for right or wrong reasons. So that brings me also to the question, I mean, all three of you have in your own ways been beacon lights of the translation activities that you've been doing. How has your journey been in, so to say, the time that you've been busy in the domain? And what do you think are significant changes which have made impact in the past decade, which has made us bring out certain discussions like these to a mainstream forum? Who would like to start?
I translated my very first story in '92 for the Sahitya Academy's journal. The copyright for Premchand had opened, and it was a chance meeting about something or the other with the editor of the Sahitya Academy magazine, who very casually said to me, "Why don't you do this?" And I came with no real knowledge or sort of background for translation, and it was just a one-off, I thought. But I had tasted blood with that one translation, you know. And from '92 to now, it has been a relentless journey of translations. Having said that, I think I have moved from '92 to now in many ways, not just as a translator, but we can talk about that later. But more importantly and briefly, I see this as a journey from the text to the context. If in '92 I was perfectly content to do a simple, straightforward translation, today I possibly may or may not do it the same way, but I would certainly want to add another layer. I would want, even if it's just a story in a magazine, I would want to write a longish note. I would like to sort of provide some context. So in these 20 odd years, 25 years actually, I feel that I now am very interested in the context. I want to take more sort of chances with the kind of translation I do. I want to use more non-English words, and I want to let them be. And I don't want to make it very easy, I feel, for the reader.
So it's more of taking the culture more forward rather than looking at into a semantic.
There is more of the original I'd possibly want to let be, and then I would want the reader to also know the context, why it was written, which year. I think all of that is important. And maybe in the very first collection that I published in '92, I was perfectly happy writing a translator's note, which was a 2-page little thing, you know, a very brief thing. Now, increasingly, I feel when I publish a collection of short stories or a novel or whatever, I want to write an introductory essay, as it were. So I feel that is just as important as the act of translation for me.
So from translation to transcreation, so to say.
No. Actually, I have very, very major issues with the word transcreation. I sort of find that it makes me very uncomfortable. And it sort of, you know, it means that you're taking huge
ownership.
liberties.
Yeah.
One of the early lessons I learned was humility. This is not my text. This is not my book. So transcreation seems to assume that you can create something out of something which is essentially not yours. So really, I don't like to use the word
Fine treading line
transcreation
there.
ever. Yeah.
Yeah. Keerthi?
But my journey with translation started completely by accident. And when I started doing translations in 1994, Katha was primarily, besides the Sahitya Academy, of course, Katha, a publishing house from Delhi, was the only publishing house which was publishing translations and focused only on translations of short stories, which were from the regional languages, the bhashas, and all of the stories selected every year were recommended by noted writers, critics, readers from that particular language. And every volume contained at least 12 to 14 languages, representing the different linguistic groups, states of the country. The books were called the Katha Prize Stories series. The writers were recognized. The magazines which came out and published these stories were acknowledged. And then the scope was provided for translators, fresh, young, inexperienced, to do something that they naturally had an instinct or a flair for, because by nature, most of us are bilingual, at least. And all of us, practically, do have a reasonable amount of fluency in the English language. So Katha wanted to promote this activity, and mainly in among the young people, because many of us know that our children have lost contact with their mother tongues for whatever reason. And we feel sorry that all of them are losing out on a lot of wonderful writing. So if they can't read the original, at least let them get a feel of the language and the literature in translation. So that's how I started. And at that time, very, very few publishers. In fact, a very major novel that I translated from Marathi in 1997 was published only in 2014. It had to wait for 17 years to see light of day. But today, everybody is publishing translations, because suddenly there seems to be an upsurge in the interest in translation activity, as a result of which people come and ask me. And I am not one of the top translators in the country by any standard or any means, but people say, would you like to do a translation for us? They've got anthologies of translations where all languages are represented. They've got anthologies, or they've got collections of short stories from particular languages. And this is wonderful, because people are at least being introduced to writers other than those who are in the English language publishing list. I don't know the success of these books, how well they sell, but at least a beginning has been made to give writers from other languages an opportunity to be seen, read, and appreciated. I'm only talking, I don't have any statistics to show why this interest, but I have a feeling that this generation, my generation, and perhaps one generation after me, suddenly we have so many of our children living outside the country. And suddenly there is this nostalgia. Oh, we are losing touch with the mother tongue, with the language, with the home. And I have been told by so many people that at least because of the translations, my children have some idea of what India is about. Not just that 6-week holiday in India. And I think that is providing the need. I don't want to go into the politics of languages and why translations are, because I'm not sure that it's a very big market. A popular English novel would probably sell 50,000 copies. A translation would be fortunate if it sold 500.
Yeah.
And yet people are doing it because somewhere there is a need. While we're becoming a open society and open to different cultures, we're also becoming very parochial on another level. So
change in curriculum also feeding it.
yes.
You know, I mean, with more bhashas being taught at the university level, somewhere that's feeding it. I mean, nostalgia is all very well, but it may or may not drive an industry. And almost all the major publishing houses in India have a publishing wing. You have a dedicated person looking at Hindi,
translations,
at least the major languages. So my sense is that the fact that it's coming into the curriculum, that is also feeding a need for more and more, not just translations, but the kind of writing I'm doing increasingly, which is a kind of an add-on to the translation, which is critical writings on translations, which we couldn't have even thought of, let's say even 10 years ago. Forget in the 80s when we saw the floodgates opening for translations. But somewhere I think there's a link with the fact that translations are being taught. I mean, you have departments of translation studies in almost all the major universities. And you have cultural studies and all of that, which is feeding an interest in translations.
I mean, that stirs a question in my mind while we are at it. I mean, there's always been a very aspirational economic impact of languages in our society. And do you think that we are asserting our own a little more, and that is why this particular interest and the West is less influential?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, even I'm not particularly sure.
So in the sense that there was a lot of influx of Western literature that has always been. There's a Western canon that we've grown up with. But slowly and steadily we're realizing that these things that you mentioned are coming about. Does that also mean that there is some sort of awareness towards our own because of dying cultures or dying languages, and we are trying to hold grip onto them?
I don't know, Prashasti, whether I'm competent to answer that question, but taking off from what Rakshanda said about translation studies coming into the curriculum, the mainstream, let's say, courses, I think the interest has also been because, you know, at what level translations are introduced is at school level. A lot of textbooks, which used to have primarily excerpts or short stories from, let's say, English writing or American short stories, poetry, for example. Even at that level, because of the CBSE and the schools being in all parts of the country, the smaller towns, the second tier 2 cities, those texts do incorporate pieces by Indian writers, not necessarily fiction. I remember one CBSE text had the article on the Himalayan expedition by Major Ahluwalia. And I was very happy because now they were trying to make the texts more relevant to the children and who are going to be reading them. And if you can generate that kind of interest through stories, everybody loves a story, and if it's a good story, well told, what difference does it make what language it comes from?
That's right.
So that is what I think the CBSE started by including these translated stories in their texts. And then that developed into the Department of Translation Studies, or not even that, an interest, let's say. And also the course changed. We didn't have 8 fixed papers. Now they have semester system where each semester you do a different course, different credits, there are more options, and the freedom given to the universities to design their curriculum. So I think all these things have contributed.
And has had an...
I'm sorry, you were the silent person throughout this. But if I may add a historical background to this, I'm really sorry, maybe you're hogging this.
Interesting.
Very briefly, we seem to think translation is a very modern thing in India. Just because Penguin opened shop in 1984 and translation started, actually it didn't. I mean, we've had translations between languages always. And I personally regard Abdul Rahim Khan Khana as the patron saint of Indian translators. He was this courtier, statesman, scholar, one of the 9 jewels in Akbar's court, buried in a huge mausoleum in Nizamuddin East in Delhi. Now, here's a man who's commissioned translations, and here's a man who's at that point providing a link between the ancient language, which is Sanskrit, and in the 16th, 17th century, which is a modern language, which is Persian. So he's getting translations of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, many, many other texts from Sanskrit into Persian. He's also doing a kind of rudimentary translation into what was not Urdu then, but which was kind of a rekhta sort of language, various dialects of Hindustani. So we've had these people all along You see, and translation was dependent upon patronage. And patronage was being given first by the Mughals or local Rajas and Satraps and so on. And then, let's not forget the Fort William College in Calcutta,
Correct.
which was kind of a hub for translations, where it was serving a purpose. It was serving the purpose of the colonial enterprise. So you had all of these translations of the Persian classics and the Sanskrit texts into simple, easy Hindustani. The idea was that the officials of the colonial enterprise serving the outposts should have a sense of what local culture is all about. So somebody in their wisdom decided that, okay, we're going to get these Masnavis translated into Hindustani. But translation has predated the 1984 arrival of Penguin into India.
Yeah, more commercially as we know of today.
Yeah.
Daniel, how would you contrast this to the market in the UK and your experience with?
My experience is very different. In some ways it's to do with, I think, personality, and in some ways it's to do with kind of culture and context and market. And my experience, the sort of journey which you were talking about originally, that we kind of go through in our careers, in some ways is quite in contrast, but also in conflict with things that both of you said. I've been translating regularly for about 10, 12 years. I started, like Keerthi, I started by accident. It's one of those things that you just suddenly discover you're doing to your horror and shame, and 10 years later you're still doing it. There's one thing that's changed very dramatically about the way translators work in the UK and to some extent in the US. I talk, especially when I'm talking to people who are kind of joining the profession, I talk about the distinction between translating and being a translator. Mm-hmm. In which translating is the thing which we all kind of know, which is the sort of, you read this thing and then you write this other thing and something weird happens in between that's quite hard to describe, but that's the translating. And being a translator is a thing that is a very, very broad, very active, sort of activist job, at which that is at the heart, but it's not the only part of it. Being a translator, for me, and this is increasingly the case for those of us who do this job in the UK, is about talking about translation at literature festivals. It's about teaching translation. It's about mentoring new translators. It's about reviewing translators in the national press. It might be blogging. It might be running translation workshops in primary schools. It might be lobbying for translators' rights and translators' pay. There's a very, very sort of noticeably activist and kind of active and much more demanding expansion to the role of the translator that's happened in the UK in the last 10 years or so. The reason I say that this is sort of in contrast with what both Rakhshanda and Keerthi were saying was, first of all, one of the things that the new translator's role, as I see it, one of the things it is not is humble. And I think in a way we're kind of fighting against that idea that, of course, we are in service to this other thing, of course we are in service to this other writer, but actually a lot of what we're doing is also pushing against that, saying it's important that you acknowledge that my part in this, it's important that my name is recognized, it's important that I also have a voice in this conversation, that it's not just, again, as here, a literature festival is not just about the writers, it's also a chance for us to get up on stage and say what we do is important and matters as well. And again, there's a slight, I think, contrast and an interesting one with what Keerthi was saying, but also with Gulpreet's introduction of Keerthi, talking about this idea that translation is sort of an inevitable thing to happen if you're a multilingual person. I have a friend who translates in the UK who said, saying, you are bilingual and therefore you can be a translator is a bit like saying you can be a pianist because you have two hands. And of course it's true in the sense that you need to have two hands in order to do the things that playing the piano sometimes requires. But actually there's unless you that's the thing, there is certain, it's very hard to, well, not anymore obviously, but yes, there are certain exceptions to that. But the kind of the basic demands that are made, if you're going to play, Rachmaninoff 3, you need to be able to have two hands. But the fact that everyone in this room, or most people that we come across, will have two hands or one hand or arms or something, this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has the capacity to do this well. And actually one of the things that we talk about when we talk about the role of the translator now is it's less to do with being linguists and more to do with being writers. the fact that, I mean, I've read some of Keerthi's work, and the reason I think it's great is not because she speaks other languages, so that is a necessity. It's because she can write. Oh, can you not? No?
You need to hold it at some angle and
Yeah.
close to your face.
Is this better? Well, hello, good morning. It's nice to see you. My name is Danie. It's lovely to be here. But the last thing I was just saying is that I think there's something about the way we talk about translation which is to do with writing rather than to do with being linguists. The Translators Association in the UK is part of the Writers' Union. It's not part of the Institute of Linguists. The British Centre for Literary Translation is part of a creative writing school. It's not part of a modern languages school. And I think there's something about the way we think about translation which is to do with our facility with and our skill at producing a final written thing, where, of course, our relationship to the original is not irrelevant, but the focus, I think, has changed quite dramatically. And it partly reflects the way in which readers read translations. I think readers read translations mostly the same way they read anything else. I certainly do, which is also speaks to the way the things that we translate have changed over the years. But I think that shift in the last decade or so has been very significant for us.
Correct. There are two very significant points that you brought in. A, the role of the translator. Second point was also capacity development and how you look at translations, the process itself, how you are dealing with texts in the target language. I would like to go back to Rakshanda and you, Keerthi, as well, and ask you, in the Indian landscape, we are not so organized. We don't have those kind of associations which would look into the agenda, the rights, the credits that the translators should deserve. We also have the case of royalty. We also, the royalty split between the author and the translator. So I want you to talk about that.
I'll say what I have to say first, because I came into this field of translation completely unaware of what exactly copyright and royalty and all that was about. I cannot say that I'm very clued in now. Even now, somebody sends me a contract, I sign it and send it back. If I get a statement, it's usually to say balance nil because it is one copy sold, etc. It makes no difference. I just file it and leave it there, because I didn't ever think that a translator would get anything more. The first translation I did was commissioned by the author, and he paid me a lump sum, and I thought that was the end of the matter. I was ignorant enough not even to ask to keep the copyright. So the copyrights with the author. It's unheard of, right? And I think only in Norwich, when I was talking to Daniel, that I realized that I should have asked for the copyright. How on earth did I do it? But this is the kind of thing that I was introduced to, even in Katha. Katha holds a copyright for most of the short stories, and you have to take permission from the publisher if you want to reproduce those stories in an anthology subsequently or anywhere else. So I didn't even know that what my rights as a translator were. As far as payment is concerned, let's not even go there.
There's no
Just one thing quickly in response to that, before Roxana speaks. First of all, you and I have to have a conversation later about the contract you signed, because we don't have to share this conversation, but I'm going to tell you off later, not in public. But one of the things that's really important to know about copyright, the very basic thing, is if you translate something, the copyright belongs to you.
Yeah.
If the copyright belongs to the publisher, it's only because you've given it to them. The default is that it belongs to you. It's not the other way around. You don't have to ask for it. They have to ask for it, and if you want to give it to them, then this is a separate question, and they can pay you vast amounts of money for it. But a very basic principle to remember is, like any creative work, the copyright belongs to you unless you actively say, I am, by signing this contract, giving away, in exchange for $1 million, the copyright in this thing.
Well, there certainly is no association of translators in India. There isn't even a kind of a brotherhood or sisterhood of translators. Some of us occasionally meet at seminars or lit fests such as this, where we exchange notes about humko kitne mile or humko kitne mile sort of thing. I mean, how much did you get as royalty? Having said that, over the years, I think a consciousness has come in. It has been a struggle. Penguin, for example, for many, many, many years, whether it was Homer's Odyssey or whatever, would not give the translator's name on the cover. You see, it would be hidden somewhere inside, or it would be on the half-title page.
Correct.
Only very recently has Penguin India started giving credits to the translator. So I did something for Puffin, and my name was on the half-title page, and Gulzar, who wrote an introduction of a page and a half, it said "Forward by Gulzar" on the cover. And this I thought was wrong in every which way. So I've stopped publishing with Puffin henceforth. But having said that, I think now things are improving about copyright, about advances against royalty. It isn't as bad. I mean, 92, I remember I was given a 10% royalty, but they set it off against whatever copies I bought. So in effect, I didn't really make any money out of that translation. But in these 20 odd years, it isn't so bad. I mean, I'm not Chetan Bhagat, and nor am I ever going to make the kind of money that Chetan Bhagat makes from translations, but that's a given. Having said that, one does get some advance against royalty now, after all these years.
Can I speak? My experience, Rakshanda, has been very different, not because translations have been commissioned by publishing houses. There are a couple that I'm doing specifically because they've asked me to. I work more on a personal level. Some writer comes and says, I have this book, and would you like to translate it? And I say, oh, all right, let me look at it, and I'll think about it. There is no contract. There is nothing official. It's I was about to say gentleman's agreement, but it's just like that. It's on trust. It's on goodwill, and sometimes it's like buying vegetables. I quote a figure, and then the person says, "Oh, don't you think that's a little too much? Can't you reduce it?" And then, because I don't know what to say, and the book looks interesting, I say, "Okay, what can you offer?" It's completely unprofessional and not the right thing to do, because it really spoils the field. But publishers, and then this business about not putting your name on the cover, it's so unfair. I had a similar experience with Puffin. My book, I wrote the introduction to all a series of articles, writings from Gandhi. My name doesn't appear anywhere. And then I found that this book has gone under somebody else's name who wrote the introduction. They didn't even give me a copy. Forget about anything else.
But please.
One thing which is probably worth remembering, the one bit of good news of what you just said, is if you don't have a contract with the author, they also don't have a contract with you, which also means, in theory, they're not allowed to publish your work. I mean, you still have copyright in this thing.
Or put it out and give it to somebody else.
Yes,
with your name this time.
Absolutely, and there is an advantage. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't recommend this, but there is an advantage to you in them also having overcommitted, because they are presumably giving you some money, but they haven't got your commitment that you will let them publish forever, that you will let them have copyright forever, that you will have a license forever. That actually it should be in everybody's interest to do that right. I mean, it's also an argument you make with a writer that if you want me to do this without a contract, I can, but it's really in your interest as a writer to make sure these things are clear, to make sure you know what you're getting, to make sure you know what my obligations are.
That's right. And the other thing which is, I mean, obviously putting out a very clear agenda in front is we need standardization of translation contracts. Because in India, the kind of multilingual environment we are in, we also need to assert what is the per page payment that we haven't standardized, unlike Europe or in the UK. And then we also haven't got the possibility of looking at what if my piece of translation, my work of translation is being used for rights into other languages. Where does I as a translator stand there? So these are some of the issues that we need to look at, and maybe you can already give examples from your market and how.
So it's something which we do, and it's something which partly having you mentioned having kind of associations and having unions. The Translators Association in the UK, the American Literary Association, Literary Translators Association in the US. are both quite active in setting those kind of standards. We can't be very precise about things like what translation is worth per page or per word, partly because we have competition law and we're not allowed to fix the market, essentially. But we do talk about what we think is reasonable. I have something on my website which says, the last 5 contracts I signed, this is what they said. So if anyone wants to know what the sort of rough idea of what translation costs is, they can go there. But yes, there is this other concern which you raise of the kind of rights we expect to retain as translators if our work, because English is a very common bridge language, if our work is then used to translate a book into some other language. And it's something which we still haven't quite resolved in the UK, where a lot of very big writers, big international writers, will be translated into English by, one of my friends in the UK. And that translation then becomes the original from which the Thai translation is made, and the Polish translation is made, and the Turkish translation is made, and the Portuguese translation is made. If you are the British translator of Orhan Pamuk, who writes in Turkish, if you're the British translator of Han Kang, who writes in Korean, you will often be producing an English which becomes the original for lots of other people. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard then to control what precisely it is that belongs to you when your work is then being used to translate
further
Kang
and
or
further
Pamuk into some other language.
Yeah, that's the tricky line that we have there. But that means there are a lot of areas that we need to work in to kind of find clarity there. That brings me also to the point of role of translators, which you pointed out in your initial talk. Translators then become the literary ambassadors, so to say, because publishers have limited capacity in terms of multi-languages. Not all the editors, Keerthi, as you were mentioning yesterday, when they start editing the text, it's not 100% that they'll be familiar with the original. So their edits come on a very different note than how you would like the culture transfer to happen through the text. So sometimes Indianisms are dropped out. Sometimes the text doesn't read that well into its context. So as far as role of translator in terms of being a literary ambassador is concerned, I think it's also a very taste-maker role that you have to do, because then you should be seen more as consultants who would decide and kind of, so to say, fight for that this is the kind of market that we can create. Because right now there's a market which is more looked at from more economic perspective right now.
I think purely in economic terms, translators should also be given a commissioning fee, because speaking in Urdu, for instance, I know for a fact that I've never had a publisher or an editor say, why don't you translate this? Mm-hmm. It's always been me who's taken a book, a text, a story, an anthology, an idea for an anthology, a novel, to a publisher and said, this is great, let's publish this. So the fact, not only are we translating, but we are also bringing it to the notice of a publisher.
Correct.
So there is such a thing as a commissioning fee, which is given to various people, consultants and so on. Maybe that needs to be built in to bring in this factor.
Very valid.
You're using a word which makes me a little uncomfortable of an ambassador, because that sort of gives us too much importance. But yes, we are introducing an audience, a lay audience, who've possibly never heard of these people. And again, speaking about Urdu, there are misconceptions that it is about this, that, or the other. And I'm bringing, let's say, a text which is not about A, B, or C, but X, Y, and Z, other things as well.
Yes.
So I'm saying this too is there in Urdu. So one is breaking a stereotype. One is sort of introducing. You use the word tastemaker. Possibly, in a sense, one is then a tastemaker. In an anthology especially, one is providing a platform for voices which are lesser heard, which are possibly buried in literary journals coming out from the smaller towns. For example, Urdu is very vibrant in the state of Bihar. And smaller towns like Gaya and Ranchi and Patna have very vibrant literary magazines. They don't reach Delhi. They certainly don't reach an English reader. So if I trawl through those journals coming from these smaller towns and I'm able to find things that are, I feel, they sort of rise above their time and circumstance and they speak to a larger audience, then surely I think that is also a role I'm ascribing to myself.
Correct.
As an editor of an anthology. You know, so this is not just pure and simple translation that we're talking about. We're talking also about an editor's role, which I have sort of taken for
over.
myself.
Yeah. But is there any sort of a magazine or a journal in India which one can subscribe to read pieces from elsewhere, from other languages, which is consolidated together?
Little Magazine was doing a great job at one point. It isn't possibly as good as it was, but when it started, I remember reading some very interesting lesser known voices from the Bhashas.
Mm-hmm.
I think
There are several
are there?
Indian quarterly, which is very good.
I know
Indian
the Indian
quarterly.
literature from the Sahitya Academy.
Indian literature.
Indian literature, yes.
They do focus, and I think online Muse India now is doing a fairly
Muse
good
India.
job of introducing writers. But there isn't enough. They're not very well known, I think. And Sahitya Academy, the Indian literature journal, though it comes out in Hindi and in English, I don't think it has a very wide reach, because I know that some of their issues are extremely well thought out, and they have a very rich collection of literature from different languages. You know, Oriya or Dogri or Malayalam, Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, Marathi, Bangla. They are well-known languages, but you know, Rajasthani, for example, these and the Northeast, we do need somewhere regularly.
To publishing houses, in my sense, is largely to put together anthologies from different languages.
But anthologies is different, and if you had a regular, let's say, every 3 months you get a magazine or a journal which brought you the latest or some of the most important fiction, poetry, essays of that during that period, it would really help.
And why I ask this particularly is because there's also a X effect when a particular translation is being read in a language, because then we have 22 other languages where it could go to. Apart from that, I would like to come back to you, Daniel, and say, how do you do that in the UK? I mean, because there's a particular translation association, and you know, you have been representing a lot of Society for Authors, for example, currently, and the BCLT, etc. So is there some sort of an agenda drawn, some sort of roundtables that translators do together to get those concerns in a pot and move forward in that direction?
There are quite a few sort of fora where translators get together, but not just translators, but also people who publish translation and journalists who are interested in translation and agents and writers and students. I mean, I think the other thing which is important is that it's not just a conversation between translators, because mostly we end up complaining about our publishers. This is what we always do. If
A
you
whining session, quite literally.
we do that quite a lot. But it's important that actually, if we're going to change how much is being translated, how successful it is, how visible, how varied it is, this depends on a conversation that is lively, but that is also not a sort of translator partisan conversation. And so we have a lot of things, including things that we do with the London Book Fair, things that we do on International Translation Day, which is in a few weeks' time, organizations like the ones you mentioned, BCLT, Society of Authors, Literature Across Frontiers, that work to identify the problems and solve the problems. One of the things that's unusual about our part of the English-speaking world, unlike, for example, the rest of Europe, is the biggest problem we have is with import rather than export. Mm-hmm. We have no problem getting the rest of the world to read English-speaking books. Quite the contrary. It would be quite nice if people stopped reading some of our books, because actually we're exporting some terrible books apart from anything else. That, you know, if you go to a bookshop in the UK, you'll find a very, very small number of French books translated. If you go to a bookshop in Paris, you'll find huge numbers of English books translated, including really, really bad books. There's this kind of wave of indiscriminate, rubbish that gets sent out of English. And our problem is getting the stuff into English. And actually talking about things like journals, one of the things that's really valuable to us, if there are journals of good writing from Indian languages translated into English, that's also the way of getting things into the rest of the English-speaking world and to other languages. A lot of countries, and of course Germany is one of the countries that does this, have organizations that are specifically devoted
That's
to
right.
identifying their literature with a view to promoting the literature abroad. So, for example, New Books in German is an obvious one. New Spanish Books, the French Institute have this. A lot of European countries have this. Have a system whereby usually just before the Frankfurt Book Fair and just before the London Book Fair, they will produce samples of things. They'll produce a little journal, a publication, a website, something which is a kind of showcase of the best of what's being written in those countries, those languages. Partly, it's a great way of celebrating things domestically, but also it means, in a very vulgar way, you have something to sell. It means that all of the publishers in my country, none of whom can read Malayalam and Telugu and any of the languages that you mentioned, they have a way of, they have something to get purchase on. They have something to get their hands on.
And
We did have the Sahitya Academy, which was set
Correct.
up with precisely this charter. That was the idea. And I mean, it has sort of toddled along and done various things, but somewhere I think the standard, the quality of writing, of translation, of editing has slipped year by year.
And also the agenda. I think the difficulty is you also need to be sure, if you're a publisher in the UK, if you're someone from, Penguin Random House in London, you also need to know who are these people who are making the decision, what are the criteria.
correct.
Do I trust them that they're not just recommending their friends or recommending the successful things?
There has to be.
One of the things that's really impressive about the way New Books in German, for example, works, so it's a panel that meets twice a year in London and twice a year in New York, and they choose a number of German books to recommend for the program. But one of the things that makes it very, very successful is it's a panel of people, some of whom speak German and some of whom don't, some of whom work in British bookshops and British publishing houses, some of them may be German rights agents, but they're people who have a very different range of kind of attitudes. So it's not simply three people in Berlin saying,
That's
this
right.
is what we think is important.
It's not an internal
It's
perspective.
not an internal thing. And so it means that all the people in the UK who are considering what to publish from German will trust
Absolutely.
the kind of credibility of these decisions and know that these decisions, whether you agree with them or not, they're guided by some understanding of the market into which you're publishing.
Very right. I mean,
and
so
not just
not only the inter-language transfer, but the export of Indian literature is a theme. And I mean, I see at Frankfurt Book Fair every year, our representation is very fragmented because it's to each its own. But where is India in its face? Where is the Indian literature? I mean, there was a very nice initiative by FICCI last year when they created a catalogue before the London Book Fair, but that was exclusively Indian writing in English to be taken to London. And I felt that there was a scope for Indian languages to be featured as well, because there's some brilliant books that should go. I mean, Gachar Gochar is an example of creating a historical mark there. First ever Kannada book. And at the same time, we have statements from Richard Chuckin which say, don't sell us more books because there's too much English literature going everywhere, which kind of made waves in 2015 Frankfurt Book Fair. He said, what are you talking about? But then exactly that's what he meant. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done in this domain, and we need to come at forums like these. But before I put out more questions, I've been indicated there are only 5 minutes, and this is the due time when I need to open up to the audience to answer questions. We have first the lady there, and there's one at the back, and then you, ma'am, Sudeep as well. So questions.
I'll
we'll
try
be
to be
taking.
very quick because I know
Yeah.
your time. My experience has been actually with ALTA and APWT, and I did translation studies in the USA 10 years ago. When I came back to India, and my second book in translation was commissioned by an Indian publisher, so just want to put that in as a positive thing. I went to Mysore to meet the CIIL group of people and
Yes.
picked up all their old issues of the translation journal that they had. So that I could see what critical writing is happening in translation here, and have been maintaining a pretty good interest in it. But I think the issue is that it's such a large market with so many different languages. For people to come together and create a forum, like imagine an Indian Literary Translators Association, sort of on the lines of the American Literary Translators Association. I have actually consulted friends in ALTA and APWT on various, issues, and had great benefit from that. And I think an Indian Literary Translators Association would be fantastic. But it would have to cut through so many different segments, and that's the challenge.
Yeah.
I wonder how we would get
How
there.
do we achieve that
But
unity and diversity?
The heartening part is find that the literature departments in the universities are very interested in translation techniques and theories. I mean, I've given a talk at Flame. Last week I spoke at Osmania University. It's very sporadic. It's very like contact, one at a time. You know, not
But
a
Keerthi
forum.
wanted to respond to that.
You know, the Sahitya Academy, the regional Sahitya academies sent out a brochure, sent out a questionnaire to all sorts of people, members of the library, because they wanted to have a database of all the translators, people who have translated even one text. And I know that I did send my CV, I sent them all the details. This was about 4 years ago, and nothing has happened. There's no association of translators, no translators bureau. Even in the south, the regional...
I think, as you said, it's something which is very sporadic. In small hub and spokes it's happening, but what we are talking about is a national body which completely, which completes the grid, basically. There was a question at the back.
So I read an article about Murakami where he said that he's capable of translating his own text into English, but he chooses not to. So my question is, would you choose to translate your own texts? Why or why not?
Tricky.
No. Oh my God, no. I mean, for lots of reasons. I mean, I think that there are some people who can do it. But partly, I mean, I would be uncomfortable even if I thought I could do it. I think there are difficulties doing it. But also, I think there are actually very few people who have that capacity. I think being a writer is quite a difficult thing. I mean, what I mean is having the skill of using language is quite a complex thing. Being able to do that in more than one language is very, very unusual. Being able to manipulate language sufficiently well to produce a piece of kind of living and breathing literature in more than one language is unusual. As it happens, I translate from 3 languages, none of which I can write in, none of which I can speak. This is a whole other problem, which we can go into later. But I also know that there's something about the process of translation which is so different from the process of writing. I have a friend whom I translate, who writes in Spanish. He's a Guatemalan writer, who I think is a very, very fine writer of Spanish. I think he is also, and this is rare, a very fine writer of English. He is a terrible translator of his own work.
Yeah.
There's something about that process which is not the same as being a writer.
And it's
even if
also
you are able to be a
revisiting.
writer in more than one language, which, as I say, is rarer than we think. Having that particular very detailed kind of textural skill. Even then, I think it's a very different thing. There are people who can do it, but I'm not convinced Murakami is one of the people who could do it, actually, but that's another question.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
Do you have a comment to this, or you have a particular different?
I have a comment for the discussion.
Okay, we just.
I'm afraid we've just run out of time.
We've
Probably
been
if you
told
can
that
take
we've run out of time.
One question,
One question
and
is
after
what
that
we can take.
you can interact
So
with
I
me.
would skip the comments and I would go to the question. So can we take this take this together?
I'll make it very simple, the question. You know, there has been a discussion. There has been a discussion on just about everything relating to marketing and translators' rights and.
But point the microphone towards you. Point it towards you.
Oh,
There
yeah.
we go.
And but there's one point I find that's missing, and although it is hinted at in various parts of the conversation that you'll have had, is the relationship between the text, the translator, and the reader. Because if you, the question is this: is there not something that a translator brings to the project of translation? And is there not something that the reader brings also when the text, the translated text is read? And that is why, for instance, I would imagine that you get so many different translations appearing of the same text. Like Flaubert's, for instance, now Lydia Davis is translated. Then, for instance,
Excuse me, sir.
Darbari.
Can you just have you finished with the question?
Yeah.
I
So
think you
my
have,
question is, how do you explain the relationship between the text, the author, the translator, and the reader?
Yeah. Thank you. Please.
Very briefly, I agree. I mean, I think that. Yes, very briefly, I agree. I think that the relationship of the translator with the text is not a negligible one, which is sort of why I think this idea of translators being humble is quite an interesting one, because actually, while in theory we are in service to this other thing, in practice, I know that if I translate something, it's going to be different to the translation produced by some other translator. It's also something which we kind of collude in between the translator and the reader. The deal is we pretend that you're reading Madame Bovary by Flaubert, and really you're reading Madame Bovary by Flaubert done by Lydia, rather than Madame Bovary by Flaubert done by someone else. So there is, of course, what you're getting is not unmediated access. Your access is mediated by a particular person who, however much we're all trying to be in service of the same thing, however much we're trying to be faithful to something, we may not agree what we're being faithful to, of course, you're going to be getting something which is going to be determined to some extent by, in this case, the kind of English that we speak, the kind of idioms that we like, the kind of voice that we have, the kind of things that we're interested in the original, the kind of things to which we are sensitive in the original, the kind of facilities we have in the language in which we're writing. So, of course, you're going to get something in which the translator has a significance. If what we were doing was translating sort of mechanically and neutrally, and if we were going to do exactly the same thing, then why would it matter if our names were on the cover? The reason our name should be on the cover is because actually what you're getting is Keerthi's translation of this thing, not this thing unmediated.
Thank you. With this, we come to the end of this program. Let's give a big round of applause for this wonderful panel. And thank you very much.